In the very early days of photography, one of the pioneers, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, made this statement. For some reason today it seems strange to me, but a lot of photographers would like us to pretend that we don't have digital means. Digital doesn't exist. We should all go back to the last technology. That's fairly new in our world of photography. People that suddenly developed silver technology didn't all think they should go back to the albumum days in order to make things look right or like real photography. But we have, well, in this class we have been and we are going to continue to explore ways to take the medium and create in ways that were difficult and sometimes, for all practical purposes, impossible before. So remember this. We're going to go to work with up-to-date means. In our case, we're going to deal this time with panoramas and mosaics. So let's start with some definitions. A panorama is a simple goal. It should be wider than a normal view, but it also should be undistorted, so you do not get that kind of barrel distortion you would get with a extremely wide-angle lens. In order to make a panorama, it's usually made of multiple frames, and they are aligned in a single row, side by side. A mosaic, on the other hand, has a different goal. Properly, it really is simply a multi-row panorama, but it's shot for a different purpose. In this case, the goal is to increase resolution of what you would get with a normal view of your subject. Sometimes massively increased, as we'll see. The frames are both side by side and aligned in multiple rows, hence the multi-row panorama. This approach, this mosaic, this multi-row panorama, is also used in emergent photography, where people are creating 360-degree views of things that computer software now turns into a view that with the mouse you can look all around you in all directions, up, down, sideways, backwards, and move through the world that it's attempting to show you. It uses this same technology to shoot and put things together. Both the panoramas and the mosaics have some shared commonality. Both of them generally need a panoramic spherical tripod head in order to pull them off. At the very end, I'll talk about an exception for you. But generally speaking, if you want to do these seriously, you're going to need one of these. They also need to be shot with exactly matching frames in terms of camera settings. Every shot needs to match the exposure, the color balance, the saturation, the contrast. All of it needs to match, or the frames will not go together into a seamless single image. So let's talk a little about the goals of each. A panorama, as we said, presents a wider view of the scene. Well, why would you want to do that? Well, sometimes it's to convey this sense of expanse. If you're shooting a mountain range, for example, or a city skyline, and you really want to show how it's spread out over a wide distance, a panorama can really help. Sometimes it's to better compose a subject. Let's say you're shooting a downed log somewhere, and you really don't want to concentrate on the background or foreground so much as the log itself. Sometimes a panorama would be the perfect way to compose that shot. But mostly, it's to avoid the overly distorted look that come from extreme wide-angle lenses. And that's its big goal. Now, it also allows you to make larger images, rivaling prints from large format panorama and banquet cameras. These were cameras usually in large format, but in elongated format, initially designed to do, as the name suggests, shoot a banquet scene. When ritzy folks got together with their 20, 30, 40 person tables and threw these huge banquets. A photographer would be called in to come shoot them and would bring his special camera so he could get it all in one shot. Mosaics have a different goal. Here, you're trying to capture as much detail and visual information as is possible. Frequently, we can put more detail, more visual information in a shot than your human vision could perceive while you were standing in front of the scene. Now that's amazing. You can discover things in your photograph that you could not have seen while you were standing there. It also allows us to make these large files, but without the digital look that comes from oversampling and over-sharpening files to make them bigger and yet still look sharp and make them look normally. This is a way to avoid all of that. And it allows us to produce large printed images that will rival the prints from large format cameras. And in a lot of cases, frankly, be better in terms of resolution and detail. So our approach for this particular presentation in this week is going to focus on mosaics, because a panorama is simply a single row mosaic. The basic panoramic image is easier and quicker to assemble. If you can do a mosaic, then you can do any panorama. So how much equivalent resolution can we get? Let's use an example here from an old camera, a Canon 20D with 8.2 megapixels. And here is a 21 frame mosaic, 7 across, 3 deep. Well, with this, you can get the equivalent of roughly 150 megapixel shot. That would be like shooting with a 150 megapixel sensor. Modernly, we've got sensors that will go to 50 and 60 megapixels. This would be like using a sensor 3 times that size. There's some real detail to be found here. And how does this compare to large format film using 2006 technology? Frankly, it's better today than when this slide were made. But in that day, in 2006, it took approximately 10 to 13 megapixels to match the quality of a 645 negative. And it took 6, not counting the overlap, 645 negatives to fill the same area as a 4x5. So when you think about that, we have no trouble creating an image that will blow away 4x5 negatives in terms of the detail. So what do we have here? Even with this older 8 megapixel sensor, 6 frames can match a 4x5. But let's say we came into modern day, and now we've got a 24 megapixel sensor. This would equal the equivalent of a 125 megapixel sensor with just 6 frames. That'd be enough to give any 8x10 a run for its money. So here's going to be our basic workflow in order to put these together. First, you've got to get equipped, then you're going to have to take the shots, then you're going to have to process the files. We're going to assemble and stitch the image from those files. There'll be some post-assembly and pre-editing work to do. You've got to process, edit that stitched image, and then you've got to print it. So let's take a quick look at each step in the workflow as we drill down through these steps. And remember, in this first presentation, we're mainly just talking about the shooting side of this. We'll get to the processing in the next one. So let's talk about getting equipped. You will need some special equipment, or at least some equipment that gives you some special abilities. The tripod and shutter release are absolute requirements. If you're going to match the frames one to the next, then the basic camera positioning must not move between the shots. A shutter release, an electronic shutter release in the case of most digital cameras, allows you to trip the shutter without moving the camera, without putting any shake or trimmer into the camera and tripod. So get the sturdiest and most usable tripod you can afford and which you'll be willing to take with you. This willing to take with you part is important. I've got a couple of tripods that were designed for broadcast video cameras that weighed 26 pounds. They'll hold any DSLR rock steady, but the tripod themselves weighs almost 10 pounds. I'm not going to carry them around unless I absolutely have to, or unless I've got an army of assistants to carry them for me. So get one that you're going to be willing to take with you, that you can use, but get the best that you can. It's also got to be a tripod that's easy to level on any terrain, and yet hold that position with considerable weight cantilevered off-axis at times with the spherical head. So it does need to be fairly sturdy. A little spindly $1.98 special tripod from the dollar store is probably not going to suit for this. The remote cable release, again, is important. It lets you trip the shutter without moving or shaking the camera. But if you don't have one, you can use the self-timer on your camera. Just set it to 5 or more seconds. In that amount of time, all of the movement you've imposed on it with the pressing the shutter should go away. Now let's look at that spherical pano head to begin with. There are several ways you can make one or buy one, but the purpose of them is to allow movement around the lens's optical center point on every axis, both horizontal and vertical. This is going to eliminate perspective and spatial relationship changes between the frames, which would result in ghost or double imaging between items that are in the foreground and in the background, and create a nightmare when it comes time to do your editing. A lot of different companies make these. Or you can put one together yourself. Here's one put together from Bogan parts with a two-way XY axis macro rail as the base, and then a standard Bogan L bracket on top. With this, you can create what Bogan calls a QTVR head, which allows you to basically do anything you would do with a spherical pano head. It's a little clunky, but it works just fine. But here's another one that, if you were going to get one of these, I might recommend as your starting spherical pano head. It's made by Panosaurus. It's about $100. You can order it from gregwired.com, or you can also order it through Amazon. In this case, it's got a Canon DSLR with an 85mm Hasselblad Zeiss lens and adapter, just to show you how it's mounted. Down at the base is the horizontal pivot, and it's set up so that the lens axis lines up with that pivot in both directions. And then from the side, we can see, and then from looking down on it, you can see how it's aligned with that center point, the little index marks on the head. You've got to make sure that this head, using that little bubble level, is dead level when you are ready to shoot. Here's from the side, and you can see the pivot point. You can see the camera is slid back on the mount so that once again the pivot point lines up with the optical axis of the lens. So this can move on all of those different parts. Now there are some other options available. One was a fabrication that I bought together with an adapter from Photodiox that allowed me to mount a DSLR on the back of a view camera. That sliding adapter lets me shoot a number of different frames from the view camera, so I can use the swings and tilts and all of the optical movements of the view camera and still do a mosaic for product work, this has really come in handy when I wanted to produce something that looked like it was shot on 4x5 or 8x10. Here's another adapter from Photodiox. It's called a RhinoCam. And what it does is allow you to mount a DSLR on a sliding back. It'll allow you to take 6 frames to be captured by a medium format lens. In this case, a Hasselblad lens that I just had. Like the DigiView, this creates no parallax issues because all of the shots are coming from the same lens that never moves. The camera moves around to take pictures from different segments of the projected image from that medium format lens. So let's talk a little about lenses. Primes versus zooms. Resolution potential. Well, primes are inherently better, higher resolution, better optic lenses than zooms. That has always been the case. Now, modern zoom lenses have gotten really, really good. Don't get me wrong here. There are some gorgeous modern zoom lenses. And yet, a high-end prime is going to be optically slightly better. Well, is it enough better to stock up on a bunch of primes rather than have just a few zooms that will cover everything? It depends. How important is it for you to capture the ultimate detail in your shot? If for that purpose, let's say it's a commercial shot, it's important, and maybe it's worthwhile having at least a few primes that you can use for this purpose and save the zooms. There is another problem with zooms. A lot of zooms extend the barrel as they zoom in. If you're looking down at all on your subject, it's possible for that barrel to slip during the shooting, in which case the shots will not line up. So if you are shooting with a zoom lens like that, once you've got it set to the focal length that you want, use some artist tape and tape the lens down so it cannot slide on you. All lenses have sweet spots. In a prime lens, the sweet spot is usually, there are 2 of them. The one we all talk about usually is the aperture. But there's also a sweet spot in the focal distance. There's some point in its focusing range where it is sharper than at other points. With the zoom lens, you introduce another variable. There's a sweet spot in its focal length. If you want to get the highest resolution, then again, you want to try to optimize all of those sweet spots in your lens. It's just simpler with a prime lens. Now, you're going to need to find the lens nodal point, its optical center. And here we have a bit of a controversy. A good friend of mine who is an optical designer and engineer pointed out to me that the lens nodal point, which is a real thing, is not always its optical center, which is actually what we're after. But photographers have high-centered on that term, nodal point, and you will see it everywhere. Just be aware if it ever comes up. You're actually looking for the optical center of the lens. You'll see other optical points that are important to a designer or a lens engineer, the exit pupil, the H points in the lens. But what we're really after is the optical center. But almost every book on this will call it the nodal point. Why bother? Well, it's a perspective issue. That optical center is where the incoming light rays cross. At that point, everything lines up. If we move that point during the shooting, then things no longer line up. Usually, it's at or near the aperture of the iris ring, which would make sense because that's where the incoming beams have to cross. But there are some lenses where that optical center actually is outside of the lens body. So the way you find out is you've got to test for it. And that's fairly simple to do. You simply put your camera on a tripod. You can set it on the horizontal. You can put it on your spherical head or on anything that's going to allow you to move the camera, to place the pivot point over the pivoting point of the tripod and move the camera backwards and forwards. A macro rail would allow you to do this. Find two upright posts, whether they are telephone poles or fence posts or anything you can find in a scene, and position your camera where those two posts are on one side of your image, close to the edge, and are perfectly lined up. Now, pivot the camera to where those two posts are on the other side of the projected image. Are they still lined up? Probably not. So now what you'll need to do is move the camera backwards or forwards on that rail until when you pivot the camera from one side to the other, those two upright posts do not move. When you've found that, you could even mark your lens with a grease pencil or something. That is where the optical center of your lens is. So now we have to take our shot. And again, there are a number of steps you're going to have to go through in order to take the shot and get it right. So let's look at each one somewhat in depth. First, you got to pick your shot. That kind of goes without saying, that you have to do no matter what kind of shot you're taking. In this case, though, part of picking your shot is to identify the proper scale and the size of your final print. That's going to allow you to choose the number of shots and the lens and all of that. You need to assess the need for fine detail to tell your subject's story. If it isn't there, if it doesn't matter, if this is going to be some kind of abstract or some soft focus shot, you don't need to worry about this at all. This is the wrong approach for you. But if you are looking for something where all of that fine detail, perhaps in the trees, the tree leaves, the needles on the pine trees, the stuff on the ground, whatever it is, if that's important to you and it's important for your story, then you want to get as much resolution as possible. Why in the film days would you shoot on large format as opposed to shooting 35? Mostly it was for detail. Sometimes it was to get the ultimate in soft tones, soft metallic tones. All of those are the result of greater resolution. If that's important, then you may want to consider doing this as a mosaic. How many frames are needed? Well, it depends. It's going to be based on whether the final print size requires it and or the amount of detail you desire to capture. If it's on the final print size, it means you're going to need to get into a little math. I am so sorry about this. I'm so math challenged, I try to avoid it at all costs. But in this case, it means a little math is in order. If you know you're going to need a big print, a wall-size print, for example, you just got a job to do some corporate art and they want big prints for their walls, then a little math is in order. The final dimension is going to equal pixels divided by resolution. So for example, 10 inches wide equals 3,000 pixels. That would be the image size divided by 300 pixels per inch, which would be the printing resolution. With that equation, you can extrapolate whatever you wanted. If it had to be 100 inches wide, then you'd need a final image that was 30,000 pixels wide at 300 ppi. It's pretty simple math, but it's the way to figure this out. If it's based on desired detail, then just a little experience is going to tell you what you need to know. Here's my experience with the 8.2 megapixel 20D using Carl Zeiss primes. 18 to 21 frames matched any large format camera. and 24 to 27 exceeded the human eye's capture resolution, became hyper-real. It was gorgeous to look at, but 24 to 27 frame mosaic required a little work to put together. Fortunately, we've progressed in our chip technology, and now with some of the new technology with, let's say, a 23 plus megapixel camera using the same lens, now on a 5D Mark III, let's say, 12 to 15 frames will match any large format camera, and 15 to 20 frames exceeds human eye's capture resolution. And if you're shooting with one of the new really large resolution DSLRs or medium formats, and you're capturing 50 or 60 megapixels, then you can reduce this even further. How about focal length? Well, what lens is going to give you the right number of frames? That's pretty easy. Look through it and just see how many is going to divide the scene you want to capture into the number of frames you need. Again, think about zoom creep if you're going to use a zoom lens, and deal with it. You can solve it with a piece of tape, but if you don't, and you don't notice it because the lens hasn't moved very much, you're going to have an impossible editing task and no real way to know what went wrong. So solve this if you're going to use a zoom lens. Our sequence is simple. Make sure the camera is in a vertical position. That way you're going to get the most real estate per assembled shot. You're going to shoot cartoon style, meaning left to right, top to bottom. So here's an example of the sequence of frames in a 15 frame mosaic. You'll do the first row, the top row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bring the camera back to position 1, lower it to pick up position 6, and now do another row, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Bring it back to position 6, lower it for shot 11, and now do 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And you're done. That would be all there is to it. So we shoot the frames. Our camera settings, again, no auto anything. I can't emphasize this enough. If you put your camera on auto as you move across the scene, different amounts of color mix, different amounts of tonal mix, all of those are going to change the camera's auto settings, and they will not match. Shoot this on manual. Make sure it's correct. No auto color space. No focus adjustments during the shot. If you want to do a stack of these, you can. It does add some real sport to it, but you can do it. And it's been done a number of times. But for this first one especially, please make it simple on yourself. Do it all on manual with no changes. Filters, think about this. Polarizers, grad filters change the view as the camera view itself changes. They would destroy your ability to put any of this together. So don't do it. Don't use filters. And again, remember, you're going to shoot cartoon style for these shots. Moving objects, oh man, it's a problem. If you can plan for it and plan the shot to where nothing is moving, fine. If you happen to get it in one frame, think about it if it's going to then move into your next frame, and just wait for it to go by. How long does it take? Not very long once you're set up. If you're using a spherical pano head with index marks, you can almost set up that first one, set up the second one, and then just watch the index marks and do it very fast. So here's how you do it. Compose the first upper left frame, take the shot, notice the index number on the head. Identify something in the right hand edge of the frame, pivot the camera to the right until the item that was in the right hand edge is now on the left hand edge. Take the next frame. Note the indexed movement from the first shot. Repeat this for shot 3. Note the amount of movement on the index. If it's the same as it was between 1 and 2, from now on, that's going to be all you have to do is just pivot to the next index point when you're moving horizontally until the row is complete. Then we're going to need to take the next row. Move back to the position of the first shot. Pivot the camera down until some item that was at the bottom of the frame in the first shot is at the top of the frame in the second shot. Note the index marks. Now, proceed to shoot row 2 using the same horizontal index increments that you did for row 1. For row 3, return to the index point for that first shot in row 2. And then select an item at the bottom of the frame, pivot down until it's at the top of the frame, take the shot, and proceed across the row as you did for rows 1 and 2. It's really pretty simple to do. And once you've done it a few times, you'll be surprised how fast you can whip off one of these, particularly if you're not crazy and are not shooting 20 or 30 frames. Once all of the frames are captured, it's going to be time to move to the computer for pre-processing, or as Lightroom calls it, development and matching of the captured frames. I'd be remiss if I didn't give you something to think about. If the subject is far enough away, and again, think skyline shot as a good example, and if the lens is long enough, say 135 to 200 millimeters, and if there is very little pivoting movement between the frames, either vertically or horizontally, then, and then only, you might be able to do a small mosaic or pan without a special spherical pano head. To save the money buying one, this might be worth trying on one. For example, I did one of a large aloe bush in my yard by standing across the yard and shooting it with a 400 millimeter lens. There was only a couple of degrees of movement between each shot, and it worked out fine. And there was nothing in the foreground. So to get the hang of it, I would highly, highly, highly recommend making your first mosaic a simple one of maybe 6 images, 3 by 2 or 3 columns of 2 rows. If you like what's happened when you get the final image together, then you can tackle more extreme versions. But I'd practice a little bit first. Make it easy on yourself. Do it simply. This use of multiple images is going to come in handy for some other stuff we're going to be doing down the line. So take a shot at it, practice it. There's an assignment coming up that'll show you what we need to do. And that'll get you ready for next week when we'll talk about how to put it all together.